Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist, with me, Josh Hamilton. Ruaidhri O'Donnell, the former Labour staffer and head of the 2019 Battle Bus, was my guest on today's show. I first met Ruaidhri when we were briefly working in the same restaurant together in Belfast while I was at Queen's University, and since then he has gone on to work for Open Europe and then found himself working his way rapidly up the ranks of the Labour Party and into the offices of Jeremy Corbyn whilst he was leader of the opposition. For me, this was a really fascinating episode, as it gave me a chance to get an inside look at life inside Corbyn's Labour and decipher just how much of the rumours and accusations about internal sabotage, anti-Semitism and the anti-Corbyn conspiracy in the media were based in truth and how much of it was just gutter journalism. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. So, here's Ruaidhri O'Donnell. Okay, so, Ruaidhri, thank you very much for doing this, man. It's an absolute pleasure. As I mentioned there, I was curious about to get someone on who'd had some experience within the Labour Party during the Corbyn administration, because the amount of misinformation was just mind-blowing. And yeah, like there's a couple of different things we'll go over, but yeah, I mean, how did you even get involved when you how did you end up working for the Labour Party and then in the the leader of the opposition's office?
Yeah, that's a question I get asked an awful lot. It's people look at me, particularly when I was in London, and go, "How did you end up here?" It's all by chance, if I'm honest. So I had worked on the Remain campaign in Northern Ireland, and before that I'd been living in London and been kind of knocking around Labour circles in voluntary capacity. And just as the Remain campaign was coming to an end, I remember the former Member of Parliament for Ealing North, Stephen Pound, phoned me up and said, "Listen, you want a job? I need a caseworker." And I was thinking, great. So this was July of 2016, so Corbyn's been in charge, but this is just when the challenge from Angela Eagle and Owen Smith happens. You've got an instance where 37 out of 40 of the party's political advisors resign along with their shadow cabinet members in order to mount this, what people call a coup. I think it's a bit disingenuous calling it a coup. It was a leadership challenge. As much as I didn't agree with it and knew it wasn't going to work, I think calling it a coup is a bit much. So they had to fill gaps both within the shadow cabinet and within the advisors with anyone they could find. So at the time, I had an accent, and I would consider myself in the left wing of the Labour Party, perhaps not the furthest left, but definitely the left of the centre of the Labour Party, if that exists. And so, yeah, they appointed a fellow called Dave Anderson to be the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and I was working as a caseworker for Steve Pound, who was the junior minister for Northern Ireland. So I just sort of fell into it, and I'd helped out on an interim basis, and then they said, "Listen, can you stay on because you seem to know what you're doing?" Which was, I have to say, a bit of a baptism of fire. You're talking about going into this job when the entire sort of infrastructure of the Labour Party has changed. So you've got no one knew what they were doing, not just me, which made me feel a lot better at the time, but it also meant that we were sort of feeling our way around in the dark. Which I think was noticeable. But you've got it in terms of the context of what I was doing within my role. You've got, this is just in the run-up to the collapse of institutions in Northern Ireland, and it's in the middle of everything to do with Brexit. So it's a lot that's going on. Interesting time, but very glad to do it. Being the Labour Party's advisor in Northern Ireland was something that I always sort of aimed to be doing. I just didn't think it was going to happen when I was 23. So it's been a strange couple of years. I was just in London there yesterday, so Monday, Tuesday this week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and it's a different place. And I have to say, Keir Starmer, I think, is doing a pretty good job. I was speaking to him yesterday. It's a different style, and I think it has the capacity to do a lot of the things that the Corbyn project, as people call it. But the ideas that were there, the ideas that were in both 2017 and 2019 manifestos, that they can be carried forward, because irrespective of what people thought of Jeremy, I think I can say with relative confidence that the manifesto, particularly in 2017, when it was slightly more boiled down than it was in 2019, people liked it when they read it. It's only when they saw the label. Okay, now this is according to polls, and we can trust polls as much as you want, but I think there was some stuff in there that's genuinely transformational to people's lives.
No, that was always one of the things I was really like. People would have criticized my personal belief that that's the program that they needed, that the Britain needed, or still needs, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And the criticisms often sort of focused on Corbyn himself, but I'll be really curious as to whether the platform for me was the important thing. Like, that was the manifesto, the ideas were the important thing, and I'll be curious to see whether Keir Starmer is going to take that forward. And I want to get onto him later, but when you started, when you first came in, you were saying it was a bit sort of chaotic and maybe to say the least. That was definitely, I definitely got that impression sort of watching it, but. I mean, we're cursed with interesting times at the minute. Everything in the world seems to have happened in the last 5 years.
Yeah, let's hope that slows down a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem to be, but fingers crossed. Like one of the early criticisms that people often gave of Corbyn's Labour Party was that they were sort of very hostile to the press, and that they were basically unwilling to play the game as such. And is that the impression that you got from inside the party?
I don't know that we were unwilling to play the game, because I think we did. We did do the op-eds. We did go on all the shows, that all the broadcast. Was there a hostility? Yeah, I do think there was. Was that justified? Probably. You have to remember that the media had spent the last 5 years attacking Jeremy Corbyn for everything. Some of it justified, I have to say. There are things that they were right to attack on. You have to expect that scrutiny when you're leader of the opposition. But the manner in which they were, attacking Jeremy and his personal past in a way that, if you look at the moment, they're not doing with Boris Johnson. He's not had the same scrutiny despite being Mayor of London, Foreign Secretary, and now Prime Minister, that Jeremy Corbyn had. I think there was certainly a hostility there. I think it disappeared as time went on, because you can't effectively operate any political operation if you're going to be at war with the press. There is a difference between the hostility to the press that came from the Labour Party as a movement under Jeremy Corbyn, and the Labour Party as in its parliamentary and the top of the party activities. I think from the grassroots networks that built up following Jeremy's leadership campaign in 2015, I would say there was more of a hostility to the media from there than there was from the actual leadership. And that could be seen from some of the new online platforms, such as, Red Reporter, the Canary, and Novara Media, that were trying to establish a new sort of platform for left-wing talk, conversations, and for that perspective. And that's great, and it has its place, but it's not how you win an election, by talking to yourself. For every article you could get in the Daily Mail or the Sun, it was worth 100 articles you could get into the more left-leaning publications. And that's kind of where I think there was a bit of a mistake. I think it was possibly down to the language that was used by the party, but sometimes you have to speak the language of, you have to moderate and transform your language into ways of putting across your argument that you wouldn't otherwise do, in order to help it reach a different audience. And the audience Labour actually needed to reach was the working class in the Midlands and the North, that weren't reading The Guardian. They weren't reading The New Statesman, and they're not going to be reading The Guardian or The New Statesman. And they were reading, I would draw a line with the Sun, but they read the Mail, and they read the Express, and not traditionally Labour papers. But that's the problem, and that's the battleground. If newspapers still are a battleground, I would I would suggest that they aren't as much anymore, but still vitally important.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how much like sort of emphasis do you put on how much you need to be able to have sort of that get through in the mainstream press, in the sort of traditional press?
I think that emphasis is definitely reducing as the years go on. But a lot of it is actually about opinion forming within the wider journalistic community and within commentary. It's about creating a narrative of, with Keir Starmer at the moment, they're trying to create a narrative of competence and about ability, which I think is the right thing to do. But that's
forensic.
Yeah, but he genuinely is that kind of person. But that's something you have to be putting into the public consciousness, and it's not just through one, article in a newspaper. It's about having them dotted so you could draw a line along where this is going, where this message is repeated, and that is what the newspapers are good for, because the reaction on social media is often to an article that has been shared, or so. That is how that narrative can be built, irrespective of what the narrative is. It has to be done using those tools. And I think that's what, in political parties and political campaigning, that's what the importance of the press is, or the traditional press. It is the traditional press. I would still call it the press. And this is the case, across the world. And I think there's also a difference, and there was a difference within the Labour Party, in that people who read newspapers are generally people over, in an age bracket that would traditionally vote Conservative. There's a disproportionately larger number of people who read newspapers who are over the age of 40 than there is under. I don't know that I'd buy a newspaper if I didn't work in politics, but I do, only because I work in politics.
What do you read?
I read the Daily Mirror. And I also read the Financial Times. I like the Mirror. I like their journalism. They also cover Northern Ireland local stuff better than most of the UK-wide papers. And to be completely honest, it's the only crossword I can finish. So there's a bit of that. But also the Financial Times, just because I think it gives a really good, the word forensics coming up again, forensic analysis of some of the more of the international and geopolitical trends that you don't. You can get commentary on that in a lot of the other papers, particularly, the Times or the Guardian or the Irish Times. I also read the Irish Times, which is another fantastic newspaper. But the FT kind of goes into a bit more granular detail. Sometimes you don't want that, but it's you might learn something about the Caspian Sea and natural gas. There's something that you're not going to find elsewhere. So it's more of a horizon broadening thing that keep it up to date with what's happening. But I think that the Labour Party, because it had this influx of new and younger members, who were the bread and butter of the Corbynism, I think, they weren't the people that bought newspapers. They were the people that were on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So you kind of have to have a blended approach to play to both audiences. And I think I don't know. I'm not going to say that wasn't the case under the Corbyn leadership, but I think that I actually think there was the right proportion spent time-wise and effort-wise on social media, because I do think that the Labour Party was ahead of the curve on that, but wasn't enough.
Yeah, I mean, something that I remember being struck by there was a great book written called Betting the House.
Fantastic book.
Yeah, and it really was very sort of complimentary of the way in which in 2017 the Labour Party used their social media game, especially things like Snapchat and the sort of ride sharing things that Momentum ran to get people to canvassing and then to the polls. And there were some really brilliantly creative ways of using the sort of the resource that they had in sort of people and time compared to sort of traditional sort of cash money.
The Tories can outspend Labour any day of the week, but they can't people power them. The membership of the Labour Party still is staggeringly big, And it's not just people who pay their membership fees and never do anything. It's an awful lot of people who are genuinely getting involved. And I think Momentum's my nearest marginal app during the 2017 election really changed the game in a lot of seats. I remember I was a member of the Streatham CLP, which was safe as houses, but we were sending people down to Croydon, down to Brentford or Ealing Central and Acton, or I had previously been a member in West Hampstead and Kilburn, which was incredibly marginal. But they were getting more people coming down to knock on doors and they hand out leaflets than they could actually facilitate. And if you look at, I think Rupa Hoxie of Ealing Central and Acton, which was going to be one of the targets for the government, I think she got a 17,000 majority after 2017 from a very marginal one. And we can argue the toss on what is that got to do with the record of the public representative. Is it got to do with the messaging of the party overall, or has it got to do with the ground more? It's a combination of those, but I definitely think it was probably one of the finest hours of Momentum. I'm not a Momentum member, nor have I ever been, but they definitely changed a lot of people's minds about how that sort of style of Labour politics works, because gone are the days of armchair generals, and it's now people actually out rolling their sleeves up and getting involved, and that's great.
Well, I mean, I think it kind of shows you even in the most, the first election that really went sort of, aside from maybe the Brexit vote, that went like hyper social media, that one of the big factors in how the vote went ultimately it needed what half a point more or something to swing it, and it was mad. But it went from there was I think it was a 22 point swing, from the worst polling deficit to where it ended up, which is madness when you think we've got all these incredible powerful social technology, and the thing that got it was arguably just people on the street, which is I mean it sort of gives me a little hope that the future might not be completely despairingly controlled by technology.
The technology is definitely going to play a massive role, but it also takes people to be out and creating the stuff for the content for that, and that is people still going out and knocking on doors and talking to people and finding out what's happening. But I just that swing from the start of that campaign, none of us saw that coming. But I think that's kind of what gave us that flexibility in what we were doing, because everyone was telling us we were going to get stuffed. So we kind of thought, well, let's just go out and do this and do it the way we want to do it, and be a bit ballsy about it. Because what was the worst? The worst that was going to happen is what people were predicting was going to happen.
Yeah. That was literally the worst case scenario.
The conventional ways of doing things were able to be thrown out the window, and we were able to enjoy it's not the word, but do it the way. I think Jeremy was able to do it the way he wanted to do it, because at the end of the day, it was going to be him that was going to be responsible for it, irrespective of the result. No, we didn't win it, and there's an awful lot of people who we're very pleased with, including myself, but we didn't win it, and it wasn't enough. And that, I think there was a bit of a foot off the pedal for a while after that, because people were still slapping themselves in the back. Although I have to say, after that election, we were on an election footing until the 2019 election, because the way the numbers were, we had to be continuously prepared. And Boris just then sort of pulled the plug and went. It's been an incredible couple of years.
Yeah.
Also incredible to note that since 1995, the Tories have only won a majority twice. So in my lifetime, they've only won a majority twice, under Cameron and under Boris. So their victories and their abilities should not be overestimated either. That our time will come, as they say.
That's a wild statistic, actually. They've only won a majority twice in our entire lifetime.
Yeah. David Cameron and Boris Johnson are the only. Since, sorry, it's actually since 1992, since the 92 election with John Major, so it's even longer than that. It's 20. That's a long time. Now, Labour hasn't won one since 2005, so it cuts both ways. That, but it's when you think about it in that context, because we've had a couple of years of our politics changing so drastically, so quickly through different world events, that you kind of forget when you take a step back that there's longer term trends that in terms of electoral politics that will eventually come back to seeing Labour in power and Tories in the wilderness. It's just, it is how it will work naturally because people get fed up with the same people.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just sort of human nature. I think that there's not very many leaders that I can think of in history that were just revered till the end. I think the only one that I can really think of is FDR. That's literally it. And he won the war, dropped the bomb, and sort of rebuilt the country after the crash. I don't think they were ever going to get pissed with him. But
it's always better to go when they still like you.
Yeah,
instead of linger at all.
Yeah, but so. Why do you think the British media, sorry to go back to that, went so heavily after Jeremy Corbyn? I mean, there's a lot of theories as to why he was so vilified, and it could be because he was a communist, Britain-hating, Britain-hating communist. But I feel like there's probably something more nuanced there.
Well, there's two things that I would often think about that. One is his worldview was so consistent and actually proven to be right in an awful lot of things, as time went on, particularly the international sphere, apartheid, for example. He was so right in those things, and he was so convicted. He was such a principled man, and it was so separate to what their worldview was that they just were never going to like him. But also, he was an easy target, and it sold papers. And I think there's an awful lot of it in that. And again, it's about that issue surrounding narrative. He got stuck in the narrative that he was this Britain-hating communist who, tried to sell state secrets to the Russians during the Cold War. Shit like that. Excuse my language, but rubbish like that.
That's right. You can swear, man. Don't worry.
Right. But that narrative was created, and it was easy, journalism. No, it was terrible journalism, but it was easy copy, and it was easy for people. They saw him in this frame, and it worked. Although, and particularly whenever he was getting the criticism around IRA sympathizer stuff, that very much ended up on my desk.
Yeah.
And it was interesting during the 2017 election that it just didn't work. I think people can.
Why do you think that was? Because they really hammered it.
I don't know, because I noticed it more working in 2019. I think it didn't work because we tackled it, relatively well. Jeremy came to Queen's University in Belfast on the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement and gave a speech that sold out in 3 minutes for tickets wise.
Yeah, I know. I tried to get tickets.
And he moderated his language in a way that he genuinely believes in the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. He also helped with the negotiations with Republican prisoners and prisoner release. He's definitely changed as time went on, but it just didn't land in 2017. In a way that we were really worried that it was. It might be that people just weren't thinking about that in the context of that election. It was more about that election. I think was more about the policy platform than about the person, and the 2019 election was more about the person than the policy platform. So that's probably the flip in that. But the British press are always going to be. It's not even the pacifist side of Jeremy, because whilst he's anti-war, I don't think he's a complete pacifist. In kind of a Quaker tradition. I think he would be in favour of intervention, but it would have to be done in the right way. I just think it's very hard if you're from the left, and I mean even the centre left, to be pals with a press that's predominantly right wing and conservative supporting. They're just not our tribe.
No. I mean, what do you make of the accusations that it was literally like the establishment terrified of a man going to raise their taxes or close tax havens and, basically prevent the neoliberal hegemony from continuing?
The people that own those newspapers were never going to have problems affording the most expensive accountants in the world and hiding their money. They weren't worried about Jeremy Corbyn grabbing their tax. It's people like that were always going to find a way around it. I would be surprised if I don't genuinely know this, if any of them pay tax in the UK at all. So at that stage, I don't think that's what they were worried about. I think that they, as a political class, I think they were worried that the old boys club might be over. You did me a favour 30 years ago when we were at Oxford kind of thing. I think there's been an awful lot of people looking for more complicated answers than it was easy. It was an easy sell,
Yeah. I mean, if I don't think it mattered who they put up as the leader of the Labour Party. If you're sort of pushing anything sort of mildly left wing of Tony Blair's most right wing policies, you're gonna start and get hostility from a predominantly sort of free market or pro free market press. I also think it's less about the economic axis of politics and more about the identity side of politics. And about, do you really think that is the thing, or do you think that's just the kind of cover for it?
No, I genuinely do, because if you look at what the attacks on Corbyn were, they weren't as much about plans to nationalise things. They were about.
Okay. No, continue then. Sorry.
Not shouting the national anthem loud enough or turning up to the cenotaph without having a £300 coat on you. It was things like that, and I it's not all about economics, and it's not all about money, and there is a genuine part of the British identity that the left has had a problem in embracing for the last number of years that is genuinely important to people. And I really do think that, and I think it's something that needs to be looked at by those who are seeking to win power, because the flag and identity and our armed forces, and not our armed forces, I'm using the language of Britain. That is what the British identity is, because it's a manufactured identity. Well, it's not all identities are manufactured, but it has less of a hinterland as a standalone identity as the Scots, or the Welsh, or the Irish. It is a identity forged in the last 200-300 years. And a lot of that is not represented by an anti-imperialist left. But that's the challenge, I think, is finding a way of marrying those two together. I think it's possible. I think, patriotism doesn't mean that you can't advocate, cooperation internationally and peace throughout the world, and about assisting those nations that are less well off, particularly when it's often the fault of British imperialism that they're in that place anyway. But that's another issue.
But I mean, even mentioning that as an idea is seen as sort of Britain hating. Like how do you see a way to reconcile those two things? Because I do understand what you mean. There's definitely like a sense of sort of being able to have pride in where you've come from, or I don't know, in what your country has achieved, or the people that have been produced by the land that you've come from, like as completely like illogical, like rationally as it is. There's in like all of us almost. There's a little bit of like sort of home pride, and like do you feel there's a way to
I do, and again, it comes back to what I talked about earlier about building a narrative over a longer period of time. It's about trying. A lot of it is actually about people with short memories, and they might not remember that following the Second World War, it was Britain that was leading the way and founding the United Nations and the international rules-based order, something that since the 1980s. It's kind of stepped away from its leading position in that. And it can be seen from the EU as well. A lot of the countries in the European Union look to Britain for leadership in that body, but Britain spurned that role. And it's about people understanding their own history as well. And that's kind of a very Guardian readery comment. Oh, we all need to have better education about British history. And I know I sound like one of these people now, but I do think that there needs to be an understanding of the positive role that Britain has played internationally, as well as the negative role. You have to understand both in order to get the right view of the history. But Britain, if you look at some of the achievements following the Second World War in the international stage, in establishing what we've got today is the protections, around the world. That's really important, and that I think is something that people living in England, Scotland, and Wales should be incredibly proud of. But it's something that has to be. It's not an event. It's something that has to be nurtured and continued, and something that has to be. You have to play an active role in it, and I think that's a way of marrying those two ideas together. But at the end of the day, I'm not of a British identity, so it's a bit difficult for me to try and tell them how to express that identity and how to show patriotism towards it, because in the same way that I would be more than upset if someone from the West Midlands was trying to tell me how to express my Irish identity, which they've tried to do before. But in a lot of ways, it's not a problem for me to solve.
No,
it's a problem. It needs to be those who embrace that identity have to define themselves how they best do that.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult problem to sort of get your head around. So one of the things that I was just utterly baffled by through the 4 or 5 years of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was just the repeated anti-Semitism problem, accusations, however you want to describe it.
Yeah.
And I read and read and read and could not for the life of me figure out where the genuine concerns began and where the utter horse shit started. Because I mean, the coverage of it, especially by the press that we already talked about, was just constant and daily, and to the point where you could be led to believe that there was literally fucking Nazis going about in the Labour Party, calling for Jewish people to be locked up. That's the crazy levels of accusations it got to. But there was obviously some truth in the fact that there was some people. So what was your impression from inside the party as to what was going on?
Thankfully, I had very little to do with this because it was internal party management. But obviously, you get a better understanding of it from the inside. I always used to get asked this by people from other political parties or by people within politics, but not within the Labour movement. And some people go, but there aren't really anti-Semites in the Labour Party, and there were, and there are, and I think it was very easy for people to try and deny that there was a problem. There definitely was. As a proportion of the party, it's minuscule, but that doesn't excuse it. One anti-Semite in the Labour Party is one anti-Semite too many, and I think the party, the system that was in place posed a problem in that it kind of got rid of decisive action. You had an awful lot of, inquiries and, panels that would look into things that then had to give X number of months of a right of reply, to the person being investigated, or to the person making the accusation. So there was an awful lot of legalistic reasons why it was slowed down. You also have the fact that a lot of people, once they had these anti-Semitism claims brought against them, and I'm not going to suggest if they're true or not, but the fact that a lot of them then left the Labour Party voluntarily, which therefore stopped the investigation, made it look as though there were fewer things being resolved, and in a way they weren't resolved because these people left, and there was no closure to that process. I think the party's process was really far too slow, and I don't know how much of it was deliberate attempts to cover things up. I genuinely don't think that was not my feeling of how it happened. But again, I wasn't in the middle of this, so I'm happy to be contradicted on it. I think some of the stuff that Keir Starmer's done, he has been more decisive. Whether that's right or wrong or follows the due process argument is a different question. But I think it was a definite problem for the Labour Party, and one that I think was more damaging than anything else. And that is the unfortunate problem with a party that expands its membership as rapidly as the Labour Party did. I think at the height, there were 600,000 members. It was Europe's largest political party in terms of membership, and there were people who have been knocking around left-wing circles, who have been in little rooms and meetings with other people with very few people in them, and they've been talking about the imperialist conspiracies. And people who get involved in politics and political parties, I think, and I include myself, this by and large have a wee bit of a problem with them. Who they ever want to get involved with this kind of stuff. So then you do also inevitably track those people who are tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists, and sometimes that overlaps with the far left, and in that Venn diagram there's also anti-Semitism, which is people look at it, Israel and Jewish people as controlling the world order, and you just think, you're talking shit, and it is just, it's an otherness, and othering people is something that isn't unique to the far right. It is also there throughout the political spectrum, and it just wasn't handled effectively.
I mean, yeah, it's nice to actually get some clarification on that from yourself. One of the things I did find a touch weird was the sort of like Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite. That was I think is, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that Seamus Milne and John Lansman are both Jewish or have Jewish heritage.
I know that John Lansman is Jewish. I'm not entirely sure about Seamus actually.
It's Seamus, or it's someone else who was like a lead advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, and I was just like, really, like an anti-Semite would work with those people?
Yeah. It's kind of the IRA argument as well. I used to say to people, I wouldn't work for Jeremy Corbyn if I thought he was an IRA sympathiser, and there were Jewish people that work with Jeremy Corbyn who wouldn't have worked if they thought he was an anti-Semite.
Yeah,
and he's not an anti-Semite. Was he effective enough at driving out anti-Semitism within the Labour Party? No, but he was not an anti-Semite, nor is he an anti-Semite. But there again, it comes back to the narrative painting. It was because of the lack of decisive action on those cases where there was anti-Semitism, when you had MPs like Luciana Berger feeling they had to leave the party because of it. That sends a genuine symbol to the public. And the engagement with the Jewish community, who were the bread and butter of the Labour movement, it just wasn't right. It wasn't done right. Going and spend your time with left-wing Jewish groups is again kind of what I was saying about going and speaking to the Canary blog. Fine, but you're talking to yourself there. You need to go and talk to the people that disagree with you and talk to the people that have issues in order to convince them and to give them confidence that what we're doing is right. And that could have been, from my perspective, that could have been done better. I'm not going to sit here and criticise former colleagues, intensely, but from my reading of it, and again, happy to be corrected, but my reading was that it could have been done better.
Well, I don't think anyone could disagree with that specifically. So moving on to sort of in 2017, and then there was the Panorama episode that came out regarding just the two struggling factions within the Labour Party, and the picture that was painted was very much, especially from some of the people from within Momentum and on the left of the party, was that there was like an active plot to sabotage Jeremy Corbyn's potential to get into power, to be leader of the Labour Party, and to implement his sort of vision, or the Corbynism, however you want to define it, that they were actively attempting to prevent him from becoming, prime minister, because they were scared of what he would do, because it was too radical, or, for whatever reason you want to believe they were doing that. Like, again, what was your impression from within the party?
I was definitely frustrated by some of the, colleagues in the Parliamentary Labour Party. Do I think there was some sort of, organised conspiracy? With conspiracies, I often think it's more coincidence than design, and I don't give people the credit sometimes of being as Machiavellian as people might think, considering that I've met them. No, listen, there were people who obviously weren't happy with the leadership of Jeremy. That's to be expected. The Labour Party's a broad church. Would they rather have had the Tories in power than Jeremy? I don't think so. But I've often I've watching things as they are now, with Keir Starmer in charge, and the left of the party that would have been the core of the Corbyn shadow cabinet, they called the Socialist Campaign Group, complained an awful lot about how there was a small group within the PLP undermining the leadership. And I'm getting the impression that they might be doing the same thing. Or some of them may be doing exactly what they criticised the right wing to do. But, it was ever thus. It's just how the political parties operate. There were definitely, degrees of hostility towards the leader. There were people who were just never going to reconcile themselves with it. And I think some of those left the party. And that was, if I'm honest, I'd rather they did that than, instead of rolling their sleeves up within the party and trying to get things done. Jeremy was, at the end of the day, democratically elected twice as leader of the Labour Party. Under rules that he did not design. To try and say that he was an illegitimate leader of the party is completely and utterly bullshit. You may not like it, but I think there were an awful lot of great people under the Corbyn leadership who weren't from, his traditional political camp, who rolled their sleeves up and they tried to do the job. I think that's what you do, and that's what you should do. And you can look at the last shadow cabinet. You have people like Barry Gardner, people like John Healey, Andrew Quinn, who weren't Corbynistas, but they were just good Labour Party people. When they were asked to serve, they did it, and they did it well. And that's what people should have done instead of sniping from the sidelines.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was almost a relief for me watching it that when the sort of, what was it, 7 or 8 of them eventually decided they would up and leave and go for Change UK, which was clearly an incredibly successful thing for their career, a positive thing for their career.
Was my member of parliament at the time.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, I heard rumours that he was getting paid, that there was at least an advisor or two being paid for him by the Liberal Democrats while he was still working for while he was still a Labour Party MP.
Really?
Just a rumour, but that's what I heard.
Well, I don't know. I know that the Liberal Democrats are flush with cash, so.
Well, that's a fair point. But then if you're to believe that there's a big overarching anti-Corbynista conspiracy, then there should be plenty of money flowing around to pay for it.
Exactly. I don't know how organised the anti-Corbyn, the shadow cabinet, as I think someone referred to them as.
That's great.
Yeah, and you knew who the people were. Like, they God knows they might have been more organised than the shadow cabinet, but. There were those people there, and they're good people, and they're still important in the Labour Party, and some of them are now on the front bench. And do you know what? That's just what you do within a political party. Is it right? Probably not. Is it the reality? Yes, it is.
Yeah, I mean, like, one of the people who's maybe not traditionally a Corbynista who did very well out of sort of sitting down and rolling up his sleeves is, their current leader, Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
So there's maybe something to be said for buckling down and sort of getting on with
and doing the hard work.
Yeah.
Keir definitely did that, and within the shadow cabinet, you have to also remember that Jeremy needed Keir as well.
Mm-hmm.
If Keir had walked, which there are occasions in which I'm surprised they have the fortitude not to tell him he can fuck himself around some of the Brexit stuff. I don't. I may not have agreed with the Labour Party frontbench's position on Brexit at all times. I'm not sorry to say that. But Keir stayed there, and if he had went, it would have caused serious problems for Jeremy. He was important to the leadership because of the importance of Brexit as an issue, and he knew it in a way and was able to explain it and dissect the government in a way that no one else, I think, within that shadow cabinet possibly could have. And I was always interested when people talk about the influx of membership under Jeremy, how they're very left wing, but they're also very pro-European, which we saw at some of our party conferences where there was overwhelming support for second referendums and stuff like that. That's why when Keir announced he was going to be leader, he had kind of won it at the conference before by the way he dealt with those delegates who were overwhelmingly pro-Jeremy, but also pro-European. And it just shows you that people's politics aren't just defined by one thing. That when it came down to that election for leader, where there was a continuity Corbyn candidate, the membership cut in a different way, and it was over the issue of Brexit and competence, I suppose. But I think Keir was definitely needed. But that betrays the point. There was a need for people of talent to step up, and some people stepped in when they were to fill the breaches in the wall whenever there was mass resignations in the shadow cabinet, and they've done very well out of it as well. Angela Rayner springs to mind, who has done a fantastic job as shadow education secretary and is a fantastic deputy leader who has a great story to tell, and I think can speak to a section of the society of Britain that Keir might otherwise not be able to.
I mean, one of the interesting things about the sort of pro-European aspect of the younger members of the Labour Party, especially the influx of momentum people sort of post 2015, is the fact that they were willing to go with Jeremy Corbyn because of the rest of his platform on Brexit, even though I think many of them, and myself included, were aware that he's just probably not very pro-Europe at all. And I say
that might be sort of different.
Yeah. But so do you think that without Brexit as the sort of defining issue of our generation, unfortunately, do you think that he would have been prime minister? Do you think that without that he would have sort of come? No.
Without Brexit, the Tory party wouldn't have been as unstable as it had been, and their internal divisions wouldn't have been highlighted as much.
Okay.
I think without Brexit, Cameron wouldn't have resigned. We wouldn't have had May as Prime Minister, which increased the chances of that 2017 election. I think it's hard to tell, but I think Brexit's to stabilise all of politics, not just the Labour Party.
Yeah. I mean, like if you consider, okay, so say the referendum hadn't gone ahead, perhaps, or if you'd say maybe they'd even lost it, and we'd voted to remain. Do you think then in four years' time, then we might have had a Cameron Corbyn sort of face off that he could have had a chance at if he'd put forward the same sort of broadly popular platform, or do you think that the only reason that he was able to get that platform in that context was because of sort of Theresa May's utter collapse as a sort of any sort of
I'd like to think that positive and progressive platform that was aimed at transforming the economy and society would have been as popular. It just was an easier sell when you were up against someone as bad as Theresa May, who was looking to introduce a dementia tax, which, by the way, I think was over-egged.
Yeah, I think when it was, I don't know how many times I've read stuff about it, and every time I read something on it, I kind of get it, and I kind of think maybe if you'd explained this better, it might have been better understood. But they just didn't. They just
they didn't. And in fairness, then they thought they were going to walk that election so that they could do the more controversial things surrounding, longer term care of people. And there does need to be a radical change in how that's funded and how it's costed. And I get that what they were trying to do. They thought we could afford to lose votes over this, but it needs to be done, and we need to have it in a manifesto so it can be delivered through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. They just read it wrong. And they read, I think, Theresa May's ability to connect with people in the country wrong. No, so I think without Brexit, it probably would have been an easier sell, but I think we would have been up against a far better Tory party in that you could have had Cameron, who was a far better salesman than Theresa May ever was.
Yeah. No, definitely. And yeah, the sort of Cameron Osborne duo was quite a powerful one. Even if you don't really believe in anything that they're saying, they were definitely they had that air of sort of, we know what we're doing. You can trust us. We're very competent. We went to Eton. We know what we're doing.
Well, that is often the case with the Tories, that there is a born to rule, and they feel that they have a confidence that I think people from less advantaged backgrounds do not have. That why wouldn't I be Prime Minister? Of course I can do that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think Boris could have succeeded if he wasn't a Conservative.
No, Boris has failed upwards, and impressively so.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could get away with lying and just just lie, sacked few months later, much better job. That would be a great little cycle, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Imagine being rewarded with the highest political office in the land.
Yeah. I mean, you know what the worst bit is? He's funny. He's genuinely, I think, quite charismatic and amusing. And if he wasn't Prime Minister, I would quite enjoy him. You see, if he was just some like Rees-Mogg-esque backbencher, I could handle him. I could just find him hilarious and amusing. It's the fact that he's fucking Prime Minister.
Yeah, people used to think Russell Brand was funny until he got involved in politics, and that ended well.
I mean, I mean, Russell Brand started saying sort of exploring a lot of really wild ideas, probably for the betterment of himself, and to anyone who listened, because he was really going all over the political spectrum in every kind of idea way possible. So, which I have to respect. At least he's sort of thinking about things. But then everyone was like, "Oh well, stick to comedy." Maybe that would have been. Maybe Boris should have stuck to hosting Have I Got News for You?
If only.
Yeah. So, do you think that Corbyn, McDonnell, and Momentum sort of succeeded in one of their big things was they hoped to democratise the Labour Party and give the members a lot more power in electing the leader and sort of setting the policy. Do you think that they succeeded, or is that kind of all been very quickly sort of rolled back?
No, it's very difficult to roll these things back because they would have to be decided at the full conference. And obviously we don't have now. We should actually be on the last day of the Labour Party conference in 2020, but because of COVID, it's not happened. I think they have the democratisation of electing the leader was actually done before Corbyn. It was the democratisation of the party's structures locally and right up to the National Executive Committee. I think the National Executive Committee has been changed enough in that there is now more representation of the grassroots of the party, and that was an attempt to try and shore up the left's support on what is an incredibly important body. You have to remember this has got all the trade union representation on it. You've got the PLP represented on it. You've got the grassroots represented on it, and you've also got ex officio members such as the leader and the deputy leader, and I think there's 2 representatives from the shadow cabinet as well. This is the body that decides what the party does and how it does it. It approves the manifesto line by line in the Clause 5 meeting. It's really important. And by including a larger platform for the membership, it did mean that as long as that membership remains to be of the left and organised, there will be decent representation there. I think they didn't. I don't think they needed to change how the party at a local level ran, because it kind of works on if you get your numbers there, you'll get your people onto the executive, and as long as there is a pro-Corbyn or pro-Corbyn policy style, socialist campaign group style organised left at a local level, then they're going to have a role to play, and it's an important role, because that's a radical tradition within the Labour Party that's important. As the Labour Party, like so many, particularly in Britain, it's different in continental Europe. It's big church parties, and you can have an eclectic cherry picking of ideas and policies from within them to create something that can actually be far more transformative. I don't know that there was an attempt to change the selection process of members of parliament, or more importantly, the deselection.
Yeah.
I've always been in two minds about this, because I feel that members of parliament should, before every election, be reselected by their party, by their local party. Do I think that mid-term you should be able to do an internal Labour Party recall of a member of parliament? No, I do not. But I do think it's right that people engage with their local party and engage within the structures there, instead of being some sort of absentee MP. My background before the Labour Party was in the SDLP here in Northern Ireland, and that's how it works with that. It's also how it works with the Tories, that you have to get ratified as a candidate. The way that the party went about doing it, though, I think it was rightly seen by an awful lot of people, not in favour with the leadership, that they were trying to be ousted and elbowed out, and they were going to have to. You also had an awful lot of members of parliament who were spending so much time trying to ensure that they got reselected, that they were taking their eye off actually campaigning, or it's an intense process. So I have two minds about it, because I do think that it's fair that if you're going to be standing under the Labour badge, that those who are the Labour Party within your constituency get to decide if you do that or not, because an MP isn't it isn't the constituency at a local level. It's those that go out in the pouring rain and knock on doors, and councillors that are up at all hours, sort of helping people out. So there has to be a bit of a give and take, but I don't think anything that's been done is irreversible.
Okay. Well, so final question for you. Where does it seem to you like Keir Starmer is taking the Labour Party? Do you think they're going to drift sort of Blair direction, sort of New Labour, policy-wise, or sort of, their sort of style of governing the party as such? Or do you think it's going to sort of stay very much in the way that Jeremy Corbyn had the party in sort of maybe a little further left than some people would like?
Yeah. I honestly think that, from knowing the current leadership, knowing those within the shadow cabinet, that a lot of the policies, in the last two manifestos will probably remain, particularly those around the Green New Deal, and, National Education Service, which still has a lot of fleshing out to be done, and rebalancing the regional economy. Whether that's, how that's done and the specifics of that may differ. The last Labour manifestos were proposing regional investment banks as a way of having a bit more regional balance, and about moving some of the government departments outside of London. I think by and large a lot of that will stay. I think the way that Keir's probably going to take the party. I think the comparison with Blair is always quite funny, because Blair, every leader of the Labour Party has to be seen as a product of the time in which they operate, and trying to compare someone to Blair when he was that was the 90s.
Yeah. I mean,
as much as
my comparison to Blair in my mind is more about his style of sort of running the party. So Tony Blair was very much, it was the Tony Blair show.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, I don't feel like Keir Starmer is quite got the same ego.
No, it's not going to be the same sort of kitchen cabinet control that there was with Blair. I don't think that can be done anymore. I think with the nature of politics and in a more digital era, it's hard to have an iron grip on everything. But I do think that there's going to be a group around Keir Starmer made up of members of the shadow cabinet that will be a part of, setting the direction. And I think particularly of the likes of Lisa Nandy, Annalisa Dodds and Nick Thomas-Symonds, who the latter two they were given massive promotions by Keir Starmer because and I think well deserved. I think two of the nicest and two of the most well thought through politicians within the Labour movement who really impressed under Corbyn. Nick Thomas-Symonds is the Shadow Attorney General, the Shadow Solicitor General, but obviously he was shadowing Geoffrey Cox because Baroness Chakrabarti was in the Lords. That's the group around him, and that's a group that I think will be quite loyal to him because of the patronage he's shown, but also there's some real depth of thought there. And again, actually, Annalisa Dodds is really quite of the people that could have become Shadow Chancellor. She is one of the most radical of them.
Okay.
And I think that will be borne out in what the policy is. So I think it'll be, it won't be centralised control in the way that it may have been in the past, but it also won't be as bottom up as it happened under Corbyn. But what a lot of people seem to think is that under Jeremy there wasn't some sort of central control coming from his office. There definitely was.
Yeah.
Party democracy is great until you're running a party.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking to oh my goodness, what was his name? Richard Barbrook about like their plans to like make policy totally democratized and like using apps and like different questionnaire things to filter the entire membership's opinion on everything into a manifesto. And I was mind blown that was actually a possibility, and sort of skeptical that it was really going to happen, and it sort of didn't.
No, a camel's just a horse designed by committee. You end up, if you try and set policy with such a large membership, you can do it if you have a smaller membership, if you're a smaller party. But if you've got such a mass membership, things just get watered down so much that the policy becomes pointless and too nuanced. Nuance is great, but it's terrible when you're trying to sell something to the public. And clear and decisive policies that people can understand aren't going to get designed by a membership of 500,000 people.
No. Well, that is a good note to leave it on. So yeah, thanks very much, man. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great. It's been great to chat after so many years.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks for listening.